So it's 8 p.m. EDT. I'm Andre J, and today I'm going to talk to you about video waves. So the schedule for tonight is first I'm going to talk a little bit about camera feedback with video waves. Then I'm going to run through some stuff with the pixelation, and then I'm going to show off what's going on with the updated video waves 2.5 that I'm working on, because I have some pretty fun demo things to show y'all. Yeah, starting off here, so one of the main purposes of video waves as a program, I think a lot of people tend to focus on the delay lines because that's pretty awesome. Like, there's not really too much else out there that lets you have like that much control over feedback and video delay. But another really large part of video waves as a software program is the processing the USB camera input for doing feedback with that. Because I noticed there wasn't really a lot of trying to play around with camera feedback in like larger scale like VJ programs. Kind of sucked for the most part. So I wanted to make these controls here that did stuff that was more optimal for USB camera feedback, so it would be as fun, if not more fun, than using like the large-scale analog rigs and whatnot. So just to walk through what's going on here. So this is, I've got camera 1. Camera 1 is a USB camera that I've got, which is, one of these things. Unfortunately, USB cameras have really gotten quite expensive. Well, I mean, depends on what you define as expensive. They've gone up in price like, I don't know, 300% or something since COVID started. I used to find stuff like this for like $5. I think now you can find it for like 20, 30 bucks. I don't know if thrift stores or pawn shops are open near y'all's, but that used to be a great spot to find things. Yeah, something like this, Logitechs are usually pretty decent, but kind of anything will work, like as long as it's class compliant. That's a pretty good, rule of thumb for anything. And then what I'm doing to process this camera, so down here in the global section, you can go in and turn on things like camera flip. It's actually mirror. I started out doing like a flip thing, and I actually liked the way that mirror worked better. You can see this is it without the mirroring thing, but these flips are pretty awesome for doing feedback stuff. If you've ever played with like the Roland V4s, they have some pretty awesome mirror settings. You can do this and this. Yeah, let's leave this one up for now. So I've got that being processed over on the global zones. And then I went up to channel 1. Channel 1 is cam 1. That's this one right here. And you can see default settings are just 1 for everything. So let's just see what happens when we play with the default settings. And I turned on the PAL map, and I'll turn that off for now. So here's default settings with doing some USB camera feedback. And you can see, like, right off the bat, this is a pretty great setup. I really need to get some kind of a tripod thing for this situation. Really need to like not be like focused on using my hands for this all the time. Yeah, you can see just as dry without modulating anything or changing any of the parameters, you can get some pretty amazing feedback stuff happening. But usually what I like to do, I like to mess around with the brightness values. Specifically, I like to mess around with this PAL map. PAL map is what we use in video waves to either add or increase or reduce contrast. So if I take this down, we lose contrast a lot, which can be pretty nice for some things. You can see if we keep this right about 5, we get this kind of interesting like faded out thing where it's like blowing up the darks so they're not so dark anymore. It's amplifying the CMOS noise. And then when I start to increase this over 1, we get real sharp edges on everything. We sort of lose saturation, but if we don't want saturation, that's totally fine, and we're getting some pretty amazing fractal zones happening. And as I increase this, it'll just make the lines tighter and tighter, and it'll make like sort of like a threshold thing where it's like basically everything that's close to black gets turned into total black, and everything that's close to white gets turned to total white, and everything in between just loses everything. So yeah, that's how I use PalMap with this. Say I want to take this back down a bit, and let's say I want to add some color in here. So I can dial up the saturation. That's definitely going to help. There we go, we got some more saturation going on. Sometimes you need to trap some color in there first. And now if I want to mess around with hue, get some hue cycling going on, I really just need to add or subtract from the hue right there. So you can see if I add a little bit to hue, it's going to do this kind of stuff where it's like the really strong psychedelic hue cycling things. Whoa. And if I just take the hue down a little bit, we'll get a different kind of cycling going on. We get this kind of hue cycling happening, which looks a little bit more like the stuff that happens in the frame buffer feedback on this. It's just reducing it very, very slightly. So yeah, I do always like to remind people to try using USB cameras in feedback with this program because it's really, really nice to do. And there's not a lot of other programs out there that are like optimized for this kind of thing. You can do USB camera feedback in both Hydra and VSynth, but the thing with both of those is that you sort of lose aspect ratio information on both of these. This one preserves the aspect ratio of the camera coming in, so you have more control over the feedback that's happening, whereas if you're trying to do it in Hydra or if you're trying to do it in Hydra, you have to like stretch the canvas you're working on, like physically stretch it to max the aspect ratio. Otherwise you're going to get like weird smushing things in like horizontal or vertical directions. And if you try to do it in VSynth, it seems to like make the aspect ratio of the camera force it into the square zone instead of cropping things out. So then you lose that as well. But yeah, so this one doesn't really do anything to the aspect ratio. And aspect ratio in cameras and video, it means the ratio of height to width. So like, for example, HD aspect ratio is 16:9, SD aspect ratio is 4:3, meaning this is actually a 4:3 camera. I'm not quite sure if this is I think this is a 4:3 palette as well that I'm working with, which means the video input is 640 by 480. Yeah, so I think I promised y'all that I would talk about the old pixelate function. So let's move in from this zone. Let's just do some of this and see how this works with the pixelation. Because you can pixelate any of the video inputs. I'll put my hand down for a moment though because I was getting a little sore there. Alright. So, if I want to pixelate camera 1, I go over to this menu here that says Cam 1 Pixelate, and we hit that right there. And then right off the bat, we get this nice, chunky, pixely goodness. Fun times. We can change the scale of the pixels. So we can have, we want to have like, you know, Atari-style pixels. Here's Atari resolution. You can go down a bit and maybe get like Nintendo resolution, and maybe go down and be like, here's like 90s LucasArts video game resolution or something. So the scale here is just the total resolution, and it goes pretty ridiculous where like 1 is basically 1 pixel, the entire screen is just 1 pixel. And 256 is like, depends on your maximum resolution what it's doing here, but It'll be like noticeably pixelated, but just on the edge of noticeably pixelated, if that makes sense. You can also play around with how the pixelation is mixed with the original signal. So right down here, it's usually set to 1, which means full pixelization. We go down to 0, and it's mixed in not at all. This is just the same as if we were just passing the signal through, normally style. We can go negative here, and as always, doing the negative mixes does some pretty interesting stuff. So here it's adding some sort of like a bit of like quantized sharpness to everything. That's pretty awesome. If we go all the way, maximize that, then we get some pretty noisy, glitchy stuff. We can make some strange stained glass ritual things over here. And then you can also mix things over 1, which, as always, you go over the regular bounds, you get some interesting effects. So this kind of adds like this weird, goopy claymation style thing to everything. See what happens. It's a little easier to see what's happening with these overflows if you make the pixels larger. So look at that like goopy ooze on the side of the pixels. That's the overflow. Pretty awesome, right? It's like a weird, dusty fire. Wow. And then the other parameter of pixelate is bright scale. Now what bright scale is doing is it looks at the brightness of the pixel that's like being like pixelated and says, okay, I'm going to add that. I'm going to multiply the total size of this pixel by that brightness. So, you know, it was supposed to do something. It didn't quite do that, but it definitely does something kind of crazy. But the pixelization function is something else I'm going to continue to work on as I'm working on the 2.5 update. So get excited for some fun things to happen in that world. But yeah, let's just see what happens when we start messing around with bright scale on this. So here is some crazy glitched out nonsense. Yeah, crazy, weird, digital liquid things happening everywhere. And if I change the mix, we'll see some different things happening. Change the total size of the pixels too. So you see if I make pixel scale a little bit smaller, or I guess larger, if I make the pixels a little bit smaller, and I do some other stuff with the mix, you can see that by changing the size of the pixels based on brightness, it sort of adds like an interesting kind of depth to everything. But of course, if it's not mixed at a perfect 1, then we're going to get this weird sort of goopy, dusty liquid thing happening at the edges. And that was sort of my goal of working with the pixelating function, was this sort of like edge behavior. You see where things are sort of like messy and noisy and combining with the signal in really weird ways. That's kind of what the pixelate function is all about for me. It started off because I was just like, well, all the old video mixers that I like have like some kind of like, they usually called it mosaic function at the time, which I don't know why they called it that. Is that really like, I guess mosaics are made out of squares. I usually think mosaics of being made out of like more abstract polygons. And maybe it would be cool to try to do more abstract polygons out of this. Oh, whoa. What if I did hexalate? Or pentagonalate? Or septagonalate? Octagonalate? Nonaglalate? Decalate? I don't know what the prefix for 11 is. I know 12 is dodecahedron, dodecalate, And that's about where my knowledge of prefixes ends. But yeah, my original, I just wanted to try out and play with this pixelization function because it was like one of the handful of the main things that I used on like old video mixers actively. Think about like video waves sort of came out of my desire to like have something similar in functionality to like an SD video mixer on my computer. But of course, I did not feel like everything in those mixers was like super necessary to my personal like flow with it. Like I personally like kind of don't care about wipes that much. Although I'm thinking about some sort of more interesting ways to like integrate wipes into future things I'm working on. That is not just have a library of 500 wipes. I was thinking more like user-created wipes. Like you have like make it so you have like some easy way to like load in your own masks that you use as the key for wipes. So that's something I can't promise will be in the update, but it's something I'm going to be working on. User-created wipes. But yeah, I didn't really care about the wipes. I kind of feel like I should add posterization into this as well at some point, because the posterization, while I was initially like, I don't really care about posterization, but in the long run, posterization is pretty great. So posterization, I might try to toss into this whole mix as well. But the pixelate things, I use those all the time. I love pixelization. I love clunky pixels. And another thing I was thinking about just in terms of like how to do sort of more like how to model other kinds of like, specifically how to model like fluid dynamic systems in video feedback. So video feedback sort of on its own, you know, it is fluid. Like this is pretty liquid and fluidy. The thing about fluid dynamics is fluid, usually the interesting things you're trying to do with the fluid dynamics are like, think about how fluid interacts with obstacles. So I wanted to give the feedback some obstacles to play with. So that's why we have these sort of like edges. So if I don't do the bright scale here, and we mix that like that, you can see that we sort of have like each one of these pixels gives things like an edge to play with. And when we mix things in, that makes like makes these sharp corners that otherwise wouldn't exist in there for the feedback to feed off of. And oh yeah, you can of course, as always, bright scale things negative as well, which, you know, just like scales things in the inverse. And you really crank these up. That's of course when you get some really just like insano things happening. Alright. But yeah, let's start to play around with the frame buffer feedback and the pixelate as well. So, I'm not even going to pixelate the frame buffer yet. I just want to do some stuff with this really insane thing that's happening right now. And I'm going to mix in frame buffer 0 a little bit. We'll slow things down. We have this zoom out a little bit. Not a lot. Let me turn up the brightness a tiny amount, and let me key a little bit of stuff in. Okie dokie. So right off the bat, we've got some pretty fun things happening here, and this is just with the feedback and the pixelation. We've got the pixelate set to a massive amount, so it's kind of just like, almost just like grabbing like random colors from the feedback and tossing them back in there. You can see if I make this pixelization a little bit tinier, larger, tinier. Make the pixels tinier and the number larger. And we get this kind of a thing happening here. But the sharp edges of the pixels are really nice for the feedback to feed off of. And we do that crazy thing where we add like the negative or the overflow mix. Mix things in and we get some nice and goopy things happening. Hello, Tuanku. This is called Video Waves. This is an open source software thing I have designed, and you can find more information about that on my GitHub, which should be linked somewhere on this page. If not directly, then indirectly through my website. But my arm is getting tired now, so I'm going to have to put down this camera, and let's start playing with Let's start playing around with the frame buffer feedback. So I'm going to turn this off. I'm also just going to turn off this camera as well. So I don't think I put in a way to turn off the camera in here, but if you just go turn the bright down to 0, then there's a glitch that I need to fix. There we go. So we have turned off all the input. I'm going to go down to global and bring out this friendly tetrahedron to play with. So, as usual, when I'm testing things out, I like to use this tetrahedron just to see where I'm at. It's a really nice, friendly shape that I threw in there to help have a video source that isn't necessarily just your webcam. And it's nice to have some sort of rasterized graphic thing happening in here, so you get this nice moire thing happening. Alright, so let's try pixelating frame buffer 0. So, something that I need to fix when I work on the update for this is the pixelization is grabbing from the upper right hand corner of the pixel, which means when you do feedback with it, the location is all off. So we need to mess around with these X and Y's to get things sort of happening a bit more sensibly. But yeah, I'll fix this 2.5. I do not have a promise date for when 2.5 is coming out. I'd like to get it out there soon because some folks have been asking me to get more of my stuff available for Windows, and the 2.5 update will make everything easier to develop for OS X, Windows, and Linux all at the same time. So that's why I need to get to work on that. Yeah, so thing you can do is notice once we start doing the scaling things with the frame buffer feedback, it behaves a lot differently because of the internal feedback line that's working on here. And I like to make the pixel scale kind of large and then have the bright scaling thing be just a little bit off in one way or the other. And then you get this kind of really nifty thing happening where they sort of cancel out with one another. That's pretty cool. And we can do different things with the mix as well. And the mix does, instead of remember when I was doing the camera stuff, it did the really goopy mix things. The mix is going to be a lot grainier on this mode, and you can see that it's just feeding back. The mix, the overflow is just feeding back on itself. The more I add here, the more it'll just kind of go crazy. Yeah, so gotta be a little bit careful with that. Something that's nice to work with in this mode is go down to global, turn on blur just a little bit, and that'll make things a bit more oozy and smoky on everything. And while I'm at it, I'm going to turn up sharpen a little bit too. Make sure to turn up sharpen boost. And of course the sharpening and the blurring thing I'm going to work on a bunch too, because they turned out pretty nifty, but definitely suboptimal. So I can definitely fix up the way those run and maybe speed the whole thing up a little bit. And then let's add some motion to this. So I'm going to just zoom this out a little bit, and let me add some modulation to the brightness of FB0. So I go down to the LFO, select rate 2, amp 1, and then we'll get some modulation of that coming on in. And while I'm at it, I'll modulate the X and the Y too. Just a tiny bit though. moving like very much in one direction here, so offset these things a little bit. Alright. Let's try some different values for bright scale here and just see sort of like how weird it gets. I think this is another mode people don't really play with too much. It's kind of one of my favorites though, because it's like not really like very much like anything else that I've seen you can play with. It's the closest thing I have to like straight on like you know, like AVI glitching or MP4 glitching when you like have like you played VLC but you're doing something else that's too complicated, or you torrented something and you stopped and there wasn't enough seeders, so you only got like 96% of the file, and you try to play it in VLC and it does like this sort of stuff all over the place. This is probably the most effectively closest thing I've got to like that sort of a zone. Yeah, super fun. Once we have this kind of a setup, I really like this really dusty mode. And we try mixing it a little bit differently and we'll get some more color things happening. And then with just sort of the right setup, we get this weird, dusty, cloudy, like almost a chalky craypaw texture, which I just really, really like. So it sort of goes from like what was sort of intended to be like a fluid texture sort of thing in the right way, in the right shape. It becomes this like smoky, dusty particulate texture, which sort of makes sense because I think like sand is considered a fluid in like when you're talking about physics and stuff. I'm pretty sure that's actually true. That's not just like a weird non sequitur joke that I make. Though I do make those weird non sequitur jokes, I usually laugh at them quite loud right afterwards, so it's really easy to tell that I'm making a joke. I didn't laugh after the sand is a fluid thing, so sand is probably a fluid. Yeah, now that we've got this bonkers thing set up, let's pull in another frame buffer. So let's go into FB1. Make sure to turn the brightness down a little bit. I think I don't want the brightness to go as high as it's going over here, because if I'm going to mix in another frame buffer, I don't want it to like totally wipe it out all the time. Yeah, if we keep this maybe right around 8, I don't think it'll like totally dominate the screen. Yeah, perfect. Let's go over to frame buffer 1. Let me key this one in. Make sure these are keyed in at different amounts. So you can see this is just sort of like keying in and freezing the back and fading it out a little bit. But what I want to do is play around with the pixelate on frame buffer 1 as well. Blunk. And I just want to play even just the tiniest amount with an inverse brightness thing on this one. And the inverse brightness works a little bit better with this thing. And then maybe let's try a negative mix over here. Oh, what? Now let's try a little bit of a positive mix over here. Alright, crazy cloud mode. Alright, we're at 8:30. I think I'll probably do about 10 more minutes of this, and then I will switch on over to the Video Waves 2.5 update things. So, we're not really changing the color or anything, or any of the other things on frame buffer 1, which is fine. But I want to try doing some more dynamic things with frame buffer 0. I mean, so let me go over to frame buffer 1, and let's start modulating Z. And maybe let's mess around with the color a little bit. Let me go to the hue XLFO and just let's change this a tiny amount. Wow. Let's slow down that Z thing. It's going a little intense. Slow things down, my friend. And let's change the colors a little bit more too. And then I'm curious, what's going to happen when we start playing around more with this blur and the sharpen? So I'm going to take the blur all the way off. That's pretty cool. If I turn up sharpen boost just a tiny bit, we get this crazy sandstorm happening. If I turn up blur just the right amount, then we start getting into the super dusty, goopy zones. And definitely mentioned this before. Playing around with different values of blur, sharpen radius, and sharpen boost is kind of always a nice time, except for when you get right here and then you max everything out. So it's pretty finicky, but there's a lot of cool zones hiding in here. Huh? So a lot of the patterns that will come up have to do with sharpen radius and blur. Blur is actually blur radius. 0 means you're just blurring a pixel with itself, which means there's no blur. And then the larger numbers you go to is like the larger radius of blur. So you kind of see it popping up when things get maxed out over here. It's just super grainy and blurry. Let's see what happens when we turn off pixelate on both of these, or just the one. So FB0 pixelate I just turned off. So now we just have FB1 pixelating. So I think we're not really getting a lot of action through this. Oh yeah, so something else that's nifty right now is I can try turning camera 1 back on. Try doing some feedback off of this thing. Oh, it's upside down. Oh, hello, there I am. Oh, feedback doesn't work down here. Also, that's not how you do feedback. Now here I'm mixing the camera feedback in with the frame buffer feedback. Maybe I'll turn off the flip. Be able to figure out where I'm at a little bit better. Alright. So here's sort of where Video Waves really shines, is doing the mixture of USB camera feedback and all the crazy effects, crazy unique effects things, plus the tetrahedron. Mixing all of that together into one bonkers ass zone. What is this? The auto exposure on this camera is just killing it right now. Alright, so as promised, I should probably get on over to the section where I talk about video waves 2.5. Yeah, and now is also a great time if you have any suggestions for video waves 2.5 to bring stuff up. Usually if it's like stuff that's just about like GUI based things or like control based things, I most likely won't do that kind of stuff. What I'm more interested in working on is like the creative aspect. The polish, honestly, working on the GUIs like takes so long that like I just kind of like do like the bare minimum for that because I just don't have that much time to like really work on that stuff. And like I said, it's an open source program, so anybody is free to modify it any way they want to. And once you start messing around with the GUI stuff, you'll also see why I don't really want to do it that much. It takes a lot of time. But yeah, I'm always open for like creative style suggestions about like weird things that can happen within the signal chain. Or like, yeah, and I'm generally more interested in stuff that's like really abstracted and like large scale. So like the big thing that I'm working on for Video Waves 2.5 is using videos as modulation sources. So the big update for Video Waves 2 was adding these like LFOs in there, and the LFOs are all pretty handy. I like the LFOs a lot, but they're um, they're just kind of on or off, if that makes sense, because it's like they're one-dimensional LFOs being used on a two-dimensional video. So as a result, they kind of just like do things on and off per frame. And I wanted to have things that would modulate per pixel, and you could try to like. I thought about adding like video oscillators, and I was like, that's dumb. How about instead just do straight up any video source can also be a modulation source. And it's just going to be pretty much the bare minimum, like the basic, like you take a video source in and then the brightness of that source gets mapped into whatever parameter. And like say we have over here, we go to this collapsing folder, there'll be a little switch up here that just says on and off, and it'll say channel 1 or camera 2 siphon. And if you click, so if you do have none of those things clicked and you do all these things, they'll just do the normal stuff. And if you click siphon, that means whatever you siphon in, you can use to the brightness of that video to control any of these things. And I will show you what I mean by that in just a second, but I have to use the bathroom, so. And I'll try to edit this out of the video that I post up. Alright, I am back, and as promised, now I'm going to show you, here, let me go over here. Change the size of my head. Alright, now I'm over here, I have a whole new perspective on things, I'm right underneath the video, so I don't have to worry about the GUI hitting me in the head all the time. That's pretty helpful. It's a weird perspective down here. I guess I probably should fix this not live. So yeah, so what I've loaded up here, another nifty thing that's going to be happening with the Video Waves update is I'm making fully functional versions of Spectral Mesh and Artificial Life. Two of the other video synthesis things that I make and sell over on my Etsy shop. So Spectral Mesh and Artificial Life will both be fully booted for the desktop, laptop versions. And these ones you'll both be able to run with your Nano control too, using the scene settings. But they will have way more controls on the GUI as well, and probably some enhanced features because there's just more things you could do on a desktop than in the video synthesis ecosphere are my environment. But yeah, so this little thing with the oscillators over here, this is artificial life. But I'm going to use that as a seed for this because it's the most, it's nice to have something that's just grayscale and can be used to like mess around with this thing. So, as usual, when I'm testing things out, I want my tetrahedron involved, and I want to remove the camera. More or less. That worked out. So, right now, for testing things out and getting parameter things like all set up, I've got basically just everything on frame buffer 0 set up to be mapped to the brightness. So for maximum obviousness, I'm going to set the artificial life oscillator to a square wave. And then let's go over to frame buffer 0 and let's map that to Z. A little bit tinier. Still haven't fixed all of the ranges yet. But you can see it's kind of the way that the parameters and the feedback work, because it's like incremental things. It's going to do a little bit, not going to do exactly what you think it would in terms of this sort of stuff, but pretty close. If we do the same thing to brightness. Oh, that's why it's not doing that. I forgot to, it's grabbing from the other camera. There we go. Alright, so now it's grabbing from the right source. At the moment, all of these things are kind of inverted. Not all of them, but a bunch of them are. Might be able to see it a little bit better if I do this inverted thing. Yeah, it's kind of obnoxiously strobing, but I can fix that. It's not quite bright enough at all. Yeah, you can see pretty clearly how the oscillators are matching up to displacement over here. Whoa, that's pretty nifty. And I'm going to try to modulate saturation with this as well, too. And let me go back and modulate the zoom a little bit more. And I can modulate hue with this as well. You can see this is pretty crispy. It's very rigid because I'm feeding it a square wave. So let me go back over and get back over to a sine wave, and then we'll get some things rippling in and out. And we can modulate X and Y as well. And let me try to do some more nifty things with the artificial life. Something's happening goofy here. Oh yeah, we can also map rotation to this as well. Makes me go really down and squiggly. And map rotation to this. Yeah. Here's where things start to get a little crazy. Learning curve for open frameworks is a little bit steep. Luckily, if you've ever learned processing or are open to learning processing, it's a pretty reasonable way to start at processing, learn a bunch of processing things, and then move over to open frameworks. But you don't need to know anything about open frameworks to actually run video waves. I just leave them in open frameworks because it's easier to for people to mess around and modify things if it's in that environment. So for anyone who's curious about using video waves and gets dissuaded by the fact that you have to download an IDE and open frameworks, don't worry about it. Just think of it as spending whatever amount of time, 5 to 30 minutes getting things set up. That's just the cost of having this program to play with. And most people who get it set up are pretty happy that they did so. But then also, once you have it, then you have the opportunity to start playing around and learning open frameworks if you're interested. And it's kind of, I think, a really great development platform for real-time video tools like this. I used to use processing a lot, and I learned a lot of stuff using processing, but there's basically no way, it would be very unlikely that I could have made anything that ran like this in processing, without doing a lot of wonky overhead stuff. But yeah, I think you can see just from this little demo thing here that the 2.5 update, they'll have artificial life, which is the thing running over here, and then also oscillator or video modulation for everything. So it'll be video modulation not just for video waves, but video modulation in for spectral mesh and for artificial life as well. And then also we'll try to get the colorizer thing set up for this thing as well. The colorizer should be really fast. I don't think that'll take very much time, but you know, as a whole, this whole project will take a lot of time. Alright, but I'm just about done with tonight's episode. If anyone's got any more questions, now is the perfect time to ask. Otherwise, I'm about to hit end stream over here. And also, if you like this kind of thing and are interested in finding out more about various kinds of digital synthesis environments and learning fun techniques for them, I do this sort of thing every Tuesday night on twitch.tv, Andre J. And then I switch off every evening from, so this week I did video waves, so next week I'll go back and I'll do Hydra. Hydra is a live coding language for video synthesis. And then the week after that I'll do vSynth, and then the week after that I'll be back to video waves, and I'll probably have a lot more fun updates to show y'alls. But yeah, so next week in Hydra, I think I'll be playing around with, I think functions is what I wanted to work with. Not positive. I might get distracted by something else in the meanwhile. I usually have the idea of something I want to work on, and then while I'm preparing for it, I stumble across something that's cooler. So we'll see. But yeah, thanks a lot for visiting. If you find this sort of thing helpful and educational and it helped you learn something, definitely stop on over to my website and hit the donate button, because donating for this sort of stuff helps me have the time to do this sort of free and open to all sort of things. I know it's ridiculous to ask people to donate for something that is free. These are the sort of mysterious inconsistencies that we must live with in capitalism. Alright, thanks a bunch, and have fun.